The end of the Civil War brought with it the monumental task of physically, politically, economically, and socially repairing the United States. Questions existed over how most efficiently and effectively to make this happen. There were two different approaches to Reconstruction. Presidential Reconstruction proposed more leniency towards the South regarding plans for readmission to the Union. Congressional Reconstruction blamed the South and wanted retribution for causing the Civil War. Their approach required much more submission from the South as a condition for readmission to the Union. Both presidential and congressional Reconstruction plans recognized the importance of rebuilding all aspects of the nation. Where they differed was in the details for implementation. Reconstruction became a conflict between the radical Republicans and Presidents Lincoln and Johnson, who proposed more moderate requirements for the former Confederate states. The radical Republicans wanted to severely punish the South for the Civil War. Lincoln and the moderates wanted to bring the South into the Union quickly. The process of rebuilding the South began before the war ended. Presidential Reconstruction refers to when Lincoln proposed the 10% plan in 1863. This plan called for each Southern state to complete 3 tasks in order to restore their status in the United States. First, they had to ratify the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. Second, states had to repudiate secession. Third, when 10% of the voters had taken an oath of allegiance to the United States, that Southern state would be restored to the Union. Radical Republicans objected to Lincoln's plan, saying the plan was too lenient and did not go far enough to protect the rights of the newly freed slaves. The Congressional plan included ratification of the 13th Amendment and 50% of the voters of a Southern state to swear their loyalty to the United States. Southern supporters believed that this was an impossible task, designed to keep the South dominated by Northern political interests. Lincoln vetoed the Congressional plan, but before he could reintroduce his plan, he was assassinated. Lincoln was shot and killed on April 14, 1865, just a few days after Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. Lincoln was a skilled politician who was poised to negotiate a flexible solution to the Reconstruction issue. His assassination resulted in more turmoil and political wrangling. The chaos was in part due to the new president, Andrew Johnson. After the assassination of Lincoln, the Reconstruction task fell to the new president. Andrew Johnson's plan for Reconstruction was actually similar to Lincoln's. The new president sought rapidly to integrate Southern states back into the Union by appointing governors who would make the required political changes. There was significant opposition to this approach by radical Republican members of Congress who wanted the South to be dealt with more harshly. Congress and Johnson were at odds with one another. The political struggle quickly escalated to a level not previously tested. In addition to vetoing Republican legislation that came to the White House for his signature, Johnson was also firing many Republicans from the executive offices they had held under Lincoln's administration. Congress responded by impeaching Johnson for breaking a federal law, but ultimately failed to remove him from office by 1 vote. The impeachment hearings lasted for months and sidetracked the more important Reconstruction efforts of the government. Because the Congress had a radical Republican majority, they were able to overturn any veto Johnson issued on proposed legislation. Rather than remove the president, the radical Republicans simply waited out his term of office. This arrangement ushered in what is known as Congressional Reconstruction. In March 1865, Congress created the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands in order to ease the transition of freed slaves from enslavement to freedom. The Bureau is often referred to simply as the Freedmen's Bureau. In addition to supporting former slaves in beginning their new lives, the Bureau was also intended to help the vast numbers of homeless whites who had been displaced or lost their property during the war. The federal government was operating as a relief agency, tasked with overseeing the social welfare of the nation's citizens. In addition to assisting with basic needs, such as food, clothing, shelter, and medical assistance, the Freedmen's Bureau was also responsible for introducing a system of free labor, overseeing approximately 3,000 schools for freed persons, settling disputes, and enforcing contracts between the typically white landowners and their black labor force, and securing justice for blacks in state courts. The Bureau also worked to reunite families and legalize the marriages of former slaves. Even with the Bureau's aid, the newly freed slaves had few options. Without land grants and with few skills outside of farming, they often ended up working for former slaveholders, entering the sharecropping, crop lien, or tenant farming system in conditions very similar to slavery. Most of those people helped by the Freedmen's Bureau were black. However, some white Southerners also received ration assistance for food and clothing. There is also some evidence in the detailed records kept by the Freedmen's Bureau that some American Indians drew rations from the agency. The records document some Cherokee and Creek tribal members on the ration rolls. The Bureau lacked any enforcement authority on its own and lost its remaining ability to carry out its mission when federal troops were withdrawn from the South. The lack of adequate funding restricted the number of agents. A Freedmen's Bureau agent was often the only Northern government representative in a former Confederate community. The agent was often harassed and threatened. Most white Southerners refused to support the Bureau's objectives, and Northern politicians neglected to give it financial support, thus causing its demise. The Freedmen's Bureau ceased operations in 1872. In the South, resistance to Reconstruction took several forms. Many white Southern citizens refused to participate politically, in opposition to the outcome of the Civil War. Southern states passed harsh laws called the Black Codes, which restricted the economic and political rights of freedmen. These state laws were designed to regulate relations between white Southerners and newly freed people. While recognizing some rights, such as legalized marriage, ownership of property, and limited access to the courts, Black Codes denied blacks the right to testify against whites, to serve on juries or in state militias, to vote, and to express legal concerns publicly. Also, the codes were an attempt by plantation owners to secure the labor supply lost as a result of the 13th Amendment, by requiring all blacks to provide proof of employment or be forced to work for white landowners. Black Codes enraged Northern congressmen and the public, who saw the laws as a reintroduction of slavery. The Ku Klux Klan, an organization closely associated with the worst forms of violence and intimidation, was founded in 1866. Initially, the Klan tried to scare blacks into compliance and keep them from voting. Klan members attacked anyone who tried to support Reconstruction. Anyone whom Klan members disliked could be attacked, beaten, or brutally murdered, often in front of family members. To combat inequality perpetuated through the Black Codes and Klan violence, the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868. More complex than the 13th Amendment, it declares that all people born or naturalized in the United States are citizens, regardless of race. As a Reconstruction amendment, this provision meant that former slaves were indeed citizens of the United States. The second provision of the 14th Amendment requires that states protect the rights of all United States citizens. States are expected to provide equal protection of the laws and due process of law. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, gave freedmen the right to vote. The amendment reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." By 1870, all the former Confederate states had been readmitted to the Union. Federal troops remained in the South to enforce the provisions of Reconstruction and to protect former slaves from mob violence. The efforts of the federal government to direct the rebuilding of the physical, social, and economic features of the United States began at the conclusion of the Civil War and ended with Rutherford B. Hayes' election to the presidency in 1876 and the withdrawal of federal troops in the South. Without federal government oversight, racial equality was not protected in the South. Political and economic factors contributed to the federal government's abandonment of Reconstruction.